The Ides of March are upon us, and with that, anniversary season.
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
This month, we commemorate that successful U.S. invasion of Iraq to overthrow an evil dictator.
Wrong country.
The U.S. war on Libya?
Still wrong country.
I mean the revolution in Syria. So it turns out it's all of them. In March 2003, the US invaded Iraq. In March 2011, NATO started bombing Libya. And that same month, the Syrian uprising began, which, though it started out largely peacefully and locally, was seized upon by the US and its allies to arm an insurgency in the largest covert operation in US history. While these interventions weren't identical, they followed a similar regime change playbook. First, the US built support for humanitarian intervention by portraying the leader of said country as a cartoon supervillain.
Saddam Hussein systematically raped, pillaged, and plundered a tiny nation.
Left unchecked, Saddam Hussein will use these terrible
weapons of mass destruction.
I would make Assad a target because I think he's a war criminal.
Next, they slapped the country with crippling sanctions that destroy the economy and soften up the government for a potential overthrow. All the while, the US helps fund and back an opposition and sometimes even goes so far as to set up an unelected government in exile. The media, for its part, regurgitates State Department talking points and promotes US-funded opposition leaders and organizations, while totally ignoring the almost always significant majority of people who don't want the US to destroy their country. Kind of like they're doing with Venezuela right now.
The Iraqi people are grateful to the leadership of President Bush in helping the Iraqi people liberate themselves.
I am so grateful and thankful for all the American servicemen and women and those of our allies that took this important punitive measure against the evil perpetrated by the Assad regime.
Then the US collapses the state either with an invasion, a la Iraq, or with a no-fly zone, airstrikes, and support for insurgents like in Libya, or by funneling weapons to an armed insurgency, which was the chosen method for Syria. In each case, the country in question got completely fucked and everything went to shit for the people living there.
A series of car bombs has exploded across Baghdad, killing nearly 60 people.
Terrorists have flooded into Syria and Iraq from around the world.
All areas it's overtaken in Syria and Iraq to be a caliphate or Islamic state.
Some immigrants and refugees in Libya are being traded and sold as slaves.
Next, the media forgets and moves on, but every once in a while, they note that this or that country is such a mess, while omitting who's to blame. Sometimes they don't even know the US is intervening.
Right now, Brian, we are bombing 9 countries around the world, and I defy you to even name what they are. That's how bad our coverage of warfare is.
I'll be honest with you, I cannot.
Think I'm exaggerating about how bad these interventions turned out? Let's briefly review how Iraq, Libya, and Syria are doing today. Iraq hasn't yet recovered, but it's finally starting to emerge from the trauma of war. The cost? Over 1 million Iraqis dead, several million displaced, orphaned, and widowed, and birth defects and cancer rates in some Iraqi cities that are significantly worse than those seen in the aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan at the end of the Second World War. Not to mention that the US invasion and occupation ignited a civil war and incited a brutal al-Qaeda insurgency, which later evolved into ISIS and terrorized the region. In spite of America's criminal disaster in Iraq, Obama continued to implement regime change policies in both Libya and Syria by funding and arming right-wing insurgencies made up of al-Qaeda-inspired gangsters, who followed the very ideology the US was supposedly fighting in its global war on terror. As a result, Libya, a country that once had the highest literacy rate in North Africa, today has slave markets after NATO gave air cover to racist al-Qaeda-inspired extremists to overthrow the government under the cover of humanitarian intervention. And then there's Syria, where for years we were told that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was killing his own people as the US just sat on the sidelines helpless to stop it. Actually, the US was involved from the beginning, working with its regional allies Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey to arm what were essentially al-Qaeda-linked death squads to collapse the government and also kill their own people. The country was predictably plunged into a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed the country's infrastructure, and has led to Idlib in northern Syria becoming the largest haven for al-Qaeda in history. While the US didn't succeed in totally collapsing the state, Syria will never be the same. It was once a self-sufficient country that produced its own food and medicine. Today, it's completely reliant on humanitarian aid, which can't even get into the country all the time because of ongoing US sanctions that make it impossible for the country to rebuild. There's a reason these countries were targeted, and it has nothing to do with human rights. After all, the US's closest allies are some of the most repressive countries in the world. The truth is, US empire can't tolerate any country forging a path independent of US interests. It doesn't matter whether the government is democratically elected or authoritarian, socialist or nationalist, secular or theocratic. The common denominator with enemy countries is that they act independently of US interests, and usually happen to sit on top of gigantic oil reserves. This is never stated explicitly. It's done under the cover of human rights and democracy promotion. On the bright side, at least Trump's administration doesn't bullshit about their intentions.
The president's remarks to the room were along the lines of, I don't understand why we're not looking at Venezuela. Why are we not at war with Venezuela? They have all the oil and they're right on our back door.
That's right, the smoke hasn't even cleared yet in Iraq, Libya, or Syria, while American officials plan the next military adventures. But finally, we're starting to see some pushback from a new wave of progressives in Congress.
When we have intervened in places like Syria, in places like Libya, what has the consequence has been that things have gotten worse. And for some reason, the people who have led all these interventions are still able to dictate American foreign policy. It's almost as if failure is the qualification to be part of dictating what we should be doing in Venezuela.
It's true. The rise of Trump has resurrected the careers of the Iraq War architects. People like John Let's Bomb Everyone Bolton and Elliot Death Squads Abrams. These people made a mess in Iraq, and their successors made a mess in Libya and Syria. A mess so big, they created a massive refugee crisis that destabilized Europe and fueled a far-right resurgence across the West. Thanks to the persistence of these people, I'm sure in the coming years we can look forward to more anniversaries for whatever country is next. I'm looking at you, Iran and Venezuela. Let's hope the war hawks don't get their way. The stability of the world depends on it.